Hello YouTube, thank you for clicking on this video, and shout out to Big Daddy Algorithm for pimping it out to you. My name is Megan and welcome to my channel. So you'll probably notice that I got a new tattoo. Actually, let me show you this way. It is Medusa and I love her and she is amazing. It hurt like a motherfucker. Getting your hand tattooed is not the most fun thing in the world. Eventually I'm going to do this hand as well, but I think I probably want to maybe finish this sleeve before I start on hand number 2, just because that was a painful 4.5 hours that I am not super eager to repeat anytime soon. So eventually at some point it will be done. However, not for a while, because I just have to like forget the pain of that before I attempt that again. But anyways, I digress. So we are in the healing stages right now. It's healing up pretty well. I'm starting to feel like the itchiness settling in. So like for any of you who have tattoos, like you know that is probably the least fun part of the healing process, is when it gets really itchy but you can't scratch it. But luckily that only will last for a couple of days, and it looks like the skin underneath has like healed up pretty well and taken the ink pretty well, so I am super happy with it. I'm pretty lucky because like my body takes ink pretty well. It doesn't take too well to piercings, which is why like I only have the ears and nose done. I've had other piercings done before, but they just always like fall out. My body rejects them, but so far my body seems to take to ink pretty well. So, you know, tattoos it is. Anyway, I digress. This is not a video about tattoos. This is a video about Enlightenment philosophy and how the Age of Reason ruined everything. I've been wanting to cover this topic for a while now, and as you've probably noticed if you've been watching my videos, I like to talk about the 18th century a lot. I'm not a philosophy geek and I don't know much about the field in general, but I do know a fair bit about the Enlightenment and about how Enlightenment philosophy influenced a lot of social, political, and cultural developments of the 18th century, particularly in France. Enlightenment philosophy is a very French phenomenon, but it went on to massively influence the cultural and political systems of the entire Western world, and a lot of what we value and practice as a society today comes from that time. The 18th century in general is a neurodivergent special interest of mine and has been since I was 11, which is when I first read the Royal Diaries Marie Antoinette book and also The Dark Tower by Sharon Stewart, and then pitched headfirst down a frilly pastel rabbit hole obsession with any and everything to do with Marie Antoinette that has not let up since. Side note, you might be queer if you've been completely and totally obsessed with Marie Antoinette since puberty. She's a little bit of a sapphic icon, but maybe I'll do a future video on that. Let me know if that's something you'd want to see. Today though, I'm going to be examining Enlightenment philosophy in the context of how it played out in very real, historic, and concrete ways, and still continues to influence culture, economics, and public policy to this day. I'll explain very briefly what the Enlightenment was all about, and then attempt to draw a straight line from the pens of Voltaire and Rousseau to the current social and political climate in the Western world. Before I start though, I want to offer this disclaimer. I know the title of this video is kind of clickbaity, and it's that way for a reason. Big Daddy Algorithm owns me and tells me what to do, but a lot of good things came out of the Enlightenment, and overall I do believe that it was a net positive in and of itself. That being said, like everything else that's ever existed and ever will exist, it doesn't exist within a vacuum. There's a huge amount of historical context to the Enlightenment and why it became so popular, and we can't really examine it critically unless we do so within that context. It's kind of like how communism is a great idea, but in actual practice, humans gonna human. If we were all perfect and acted in altruistic, perfectly unselfish ways 100% of the time, then sure, communism is wonderful. But people aren't like that, unfortunately. And even if we were, there's just too many of us on this planet for communism to be a realistic option at this point. But I digress. Enlightenment philosophy is kind of the same, divorced of its historical context and meaning, and applied to a perfect world in which intersecting systems of power and oppression don't exist. It's a great idea. And you know what? That's mostly still true, even with all of those intersecting systems of power. But it's also done a lot of damage to social progress, and that's what we're going to be looking at critically. In this video, we'll be looking at the Age of Reason and the French Revolution through the eyes of social progress, specifically in the areas of LGBTQ plus history and women's rights. I wanted to also talk about the evolution of capitalism as a result of the revolutions of the late 18th century. But when I started digging into it, I realized there's so much in there that actually deserves its own video. So maybe I'll do that as a part 2. I don't really know. Drop me a comment or message me if that's something you'd be interested in. Today, though, we will be asking ourselves the following question. Did the revolutions of the late 18th century succeed in making progress towards a more just and inclusive society, or did they just perpetuate old forms of oppression and inaugurate new ones? Were they truly equalized, or did they just disguise old-fashioned power grabbing as liberation and progress? The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. In the 18th century, the ideals of rationality, science, secularism, and democracy took hold of the European mind as a result of the flourishing of Enlightenment philosophy. Historians refer to this as the Age of Reason because it became really popular during this time to challenge the supremacy of religion, specifically of the Catholic Church, with rational scientific inquiry. Now, this has a lot of metaphorical gendered implications, but basically for the purpose of laying a foundation here, let's just say that increasingly during the 18th century, religion equals dark and backwards, and scientific progress equals light and forwards. You've probably watched enough of my videos by now to pick up on the divine feminine, divine masculine undertones in that statement, but I'll get into more of that later. The cornerstone of Enlightenment philosophy was the idea of getting back to nature, specifically what was considered natural human behavior and social organization. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that man belongs in a state of nature where he is innocent and unencumbered by the drudgery and stress of civilization, and this is where the rather problematic idea of the noble savage comes from. You have to understand, though, how radical this was at the time. Europe had just experienced 300 years of cultural, scientific, and artistic flourishing during the Renaissance, which had been accompanied by expeditions all over the world that brought European explorers into contact with indigenous cultures that they previously had no knowledge of whatsoever. We all know what the European knee-jerk reaction was to those encounters. So then fast forward to the 18th century, and all of a sudden this French writer guy is arguing that indigenous people should be left alone. They're better off without the trappings of civilization. Those just cause a lot of unnecessary stress and bondage anyway. You'd think this would have upset the powers that be who were trying to colonize, but by the 1770s, European aristocrats had started to enthusiastically embrace the ideas of Rousseau.
Rousseau says, if we assume man has been corrupted by an artificial civilization, what is the natural state?
Which I talked about in a previous video. The problem with arguing for getting back to what's natural is that the word natural can be construed in a lot of different ways depending on who's in power and with what intentions they're using it. One person's natural is another person's satanic deviant gay sex, or the reverse, one person's natural is another person's hetero-mononormative conservative religious hell trap. Before it became the foundation of revolutionary sentiment, Enlightenment philosophy made its way into European culture first through the whims of the aristocracy, who used it as an excuse to wear their underwear on the outside and pretend to milk goats.
I must do this more often. I love the country.
And then it trickled down into the Parisian middle class, who used it as an excuse to fuel revolutionary sentiment that had been brewing for the better part of a century. Social conservatism versus political conservatism. When I compare the socio-cultural attitudes of the 18th century to those of today, one of the main distinctions I like to make is that being socially conservative and politically conservative didn't necessarily go hand in hand, and in fact, most of the time it didn't. What I mean by this is that if you were to get into a time machine right now and go back to Versailles in the year 1789 and ask a bunch of aristocrats what their political and cultural views are, you'd likely find that most of them would be very politically conservative but socially progressive. They'd tell you that they believe in the divine right of kings and that social hierarchy was ordained by God, and that democracy is unsustainable because the lower classes weren't meant to rule over themselves. Then, in the next breath, they'd tell you that, of course, women can run estates and businesses, and that cross-dressing is like really cool and trendy, and that it's healthy for young women to have intimate romantic friendships with other women. Then, if you were to venture out into the middle of Paris and ask some 18th century lawyers and shopkeepers about their political and social views, they would have told you that the divine right of kings is nonsense and that they should have the right to govern themselves. Then in the next breath, they would have told you that women are the weaker sex and that gay people are criminals and deviants. Contrast that with today. Most people who lean either right or left do so in most spheres of life. If someone is politically conservative, they're probably also socially conservative. If someone is politically progressive, they're probably also socially progressive. This difference between ours and 18th century approaches to politics and society is important to keep in mind because it forms the foundation of how we can begin to understand why seemingly progressive movements like the French and American revolutions somehow managed to move society backwards in a lot of ways. Back in the 18th century, when our modern Western democracies were being born from the fire and steel of revolutions, the spheres of society and politics were a lot more separated than they are today. Political leaders inherited their positions and so therefore didn't have to pander to the masses in order to be elected into office the same way that they do today. Because we have democracy now, anyone who aspires to a position of power needs to be aware of the social and cultural views of their voter base and then align their platform to those views. And that's why we have Donald Trump like flip-flopping back and forth on his views on abortion, for example. 18th century politicians were also members of the aristocracy. Their positions were either inherited or bought, so they had no need to worry about what their constituents thought of them and their habits because constituents didn't exist yet. There was just the king and his inner circle, and then there was everyone else. That's why it would have been possible for a duke to tell you in the same breath that he hates democracy but loves gay people. Queer and transphobia. In France before the revolution, queer and trans people were becoming more and more accepted, especially in aristocratic and upper-class circles. That being said, romantic love between women was more widely tolerated than sex between men because romance between women was seen as more pure and spiritual, which I will get to in a minute. Romantic friendships between women were very common, and there was a flourishing of sapphic literature in the 18th century written by women for other women. This is partly because women's literary contributions were starting to be taken more seriously and therefore preserved in greater quantities than they had been in earlier centuries. But it's also because sapphic friendships weren't seen as being incompatible in any way to fulfilling romantic and sexual relationships with men. The two could and did coexist without one threatening the other. Some sapphic writers of the 18th century did, however, view marriage to men as being in direct conflict with their intimate female friendships. There was a rising tide of women's voices rejecting the idea that marriage ought to be a universal goal, kind of similar to modern-day Korea's 4B movement or literally all of the feminist content on TikTok.
The same way that you would find comfort from a 200-pound weight being unshackled from your fucking foot.
An anonymous poem written in 1720 from one woman to another says, "While vulgar souls their vulgar love pursue, and in the common way themselves undo, impairing health and fame and risking life, to be a mistress or, what's worse, a wife, we whom a nicer taste has raised above the dangerous follies of such slavish love, despise the sex, and in ourselves we find pleasures for their gross senses too refined. Let brutish men, made by our weakness vain, boast of the easy conquest they obtain. Let the poor loving wretch do all she can, and all won't please the ungrateful tyrant man. Will scorn the monster and his mistress too, and show the world what women ought to do." Love and romance between women was infused with spiritual qualities and often described in similar ways to how TikTok spiritual girlies talk about twin flames, a union of souls, a merging of destinies, a life-changing encounter with your other half. It was seen as being a higher and more pure form of love than that which existed between women and men. I could do a whole video on sapphic culture in the 18th century, which probably I will at some point because I've been fascinated by it since I was 12. If you believe in past lives, I'm sure out there somewhere is the reincarnation of my sapphic romantic friend from 250 years ago, searching for me as I searched for her to reclaim the love we shared in a society that didn't take us seriously. Anyway, this is where a lot of the confusion about Marie Antoinette's alleged tribadism comes into play. By the way, tribade was the 18th century word for lesbian, and I kind of love it. Can we bring that back, please? It makes lesbians sound like Amazon warrior queens on a mission. Even though she was married to the King of France and supposedly had an affair with a very decidedly male gentleman from Sweden, Marie Antoinette was infamous for her two great loves, Louise de Lamballe and Gabrielle de Polignac. She showered both of these women with love and affection and spent more time with them than with anyone else. Even at the time, she was suspected of having lesbian relationships with them, and now she's legendary for it. It's why she's a gay icon. But a lot of that is speculation, and historians to this day go back and forth about the nature of her relationships with her two best girlfriends.
Et que ses mœurs sont des plus libres.
Vous savez ce qui me fait le plus de peine, Monsieur Moreau?
If we look at them in the context of romantic friendships, though, it makes a lot of sense. We as modern people place a high degree of importance on defining and categorizing our relationships based on whether or not sex is involved, but in the 18th century, this wasn't really a thing. Sex was kind of irrelevant, and it was even thought that women physically could not have sex with other women, even when they did engage in sexual acts. Those acts were not considered real sex, so it wasn't considered adultery when your wife locked herself in a closet with the chambermaid, which, I mean, is a problematic attitude for a lot of reasons, but at least it wasn't condemned. Unless wooden dildos were involved, then it would have been illegal, but that's another video for another time, and an actual thing that happened, by the way. 18th century people also had no concept of being queer as an identity. Nowadays, if we're not strictly heterosexual and cisgendered, then we identify as being queer in some way, regardless of whether or not we actively participate in queer spaces and or engage in queer sex. But back then, how you had sex and who you had sex with had nothing to do with your overall sense of self. It was just something you did. Marie Antoinette was very obviously queer, and I would bet money that her husband, King Louis XVI, was very asexual. But neither of them would have ever thought of themselves as being not straight, because back then there was no concept of straightness versus queerness. You could prefer having sexual and or romantic encounters with one gender over another, or with no gender at all, but it wasn't seen as being an integral part of your identity. I don't mean at all to imply here that having no sense of queerness as being part of your identity is better. I think as modern people, it's very important to identify as being queer if you are in fact queer, and that's because queer people are a marginalized group. There's tons of data that shows that queer people struggle with higher levels of poverty, mental illness, abuse, trauma, and homelessness than straight people do. In the 18th century, if you were openly queer, you were probably also wealthy and privileged, and your queerness would have been for the most part tolerated as being just an aristocratic eccentricity. Queer people were marginalized back then too, don't get me wrong. Anti-sodomy laws abounded, especially if you were part of the working class. But because it wasn't considered part of one's identity and therefore an immovable intrinsic thing, it was in a lot of ways less of a big deal who you preferred to sleep with and why, especially if you were a woman. Nowadays, the rise of identity politics in Western liberal democracies has created a backlash in alt-right spaces, and they're getting louder and more powerful. This means that coming out and then identifying with the queer community is an important part of coming together for safety and support. The societal view and treatment and status of queer people has changed, so the ways in which we identify or not must therefore also change. In 18th century France, if you were part of the aristocracy and the upper echelons of society, being queer was not only remarkably tolerated, it was also actively celebrated in some cases. The Chevalier d'Eon was an aristocrat and a spy who was assigned male at birth, but insisted she was a woman throughout her life. She dressed as both a man and a woman at different times throughout her life and was wildly popular with the aristocrats at Versailles. King Louis XVI believed and supported her and actually had her legally declared female and then gave her a generous pension for life. This might just be one of the first recorded legal gender changes in history, and it happened just before the French Revolution. King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, regularly dressed in women's clothing, and he was the one who spearheaded the French fashion industry.
I've been dressed like this since I was 3 months old.
The courts of King Louis XIV, XV, and XVI were absolutist monarchies that revolved around the personality cults of dictators, and yet they were some of the most socially and culturally progressive spaces that have ever existed in the Western world before the 1960s. Sapphic friendships, gay sex, polyamory, and cross-dressing were all normalized and even celebrated in some cases, but the liberalism of the aristocracy was quite hedonistic. They were highly educated and wealthy, and eccentricity has always been tolerated tolerated amongst wealthy elites. Just look at how Elon Musk was allowed to actually return to Earth after he shot himself up into space. We tolerate when rich people are weird. But then the revolution came and it was tolerated no more. Lesbians especially became the focus of populist hatred in a way that they hadn't been under the old regime. Queerness, especially of the hashtag WLW kind, was seen as a hedonistic, self-serving, aristocratic vice, and as hatred for the royal family grew in the years leading up to the revolution, hundreds of pornographic pamphlets were printed about Marie Antoinette and distributed all throughout Paris and the court of Versailles with the intention of tarnishing her reputation and stoking the flames of hatred towards her. In these infamous pamphlets, she was dragged for engaging in lesbian sex, whether she actually did or not was completely irrelevant, and accused of being a tribade and of having the German vice, i.e. being a lesbian. From the moment she set foot in France at the age of 14 as the intended bride of the heir to the throne, she was hated because she was German. At the time, France and Germany were enjoying an uneasy truce after a long war, and a lot of people weren't happy that a German princess was coming to town to marry their future king. So, 20 years later, when inflation got out of hand and the price of bread went sky high and the people started to starve, the entire aristocratic class and their culture and habits were blamed for it. And being queer was a not small part of their culture and habits. And Marie Antoinette was their leader, and she was German to boot. And she had romantic friendships with women on whom she loved to lavish expensive gifts and titles while the people starved. Clearly, she was unnatural and evil, and the simmering anger towards her fueled a lot of revolutionary sentiment in the years leading up to 1789. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the revolutionaries took their cues from Enlightenment philosophy, which was built on a return to the natural state of being. Marie Antoinette and her ilk were considered unnatural because they preferred the company of other women, and it was unnatural for a wife to embarrass her husband by sleeping with other women for fun without any intentions of procreating, especially if that wife was supposed to be the mother of the future king of France. Sleeping with women and not with her husband was construed as a betrayal, and that's really where the hatred of Marie Antoinette started. As the middle class began to wrest power away from the landed aristocracy during the revolution, they also began to impose their more socially conservative views on society as a whole. Queer and trans people were hunted down and guillotined because anything outside of heterosexual monogamous Catholic marriage was considered a self-serving aristocratic vice that had to be eliminated, in much the same way that Trump supporters nowadays like to hate on liberal, educated urban elites. Despite all that, homosexuality was actually decriminalized in France in 1781 in the middle of the revolution. This was extremely progressive for the time, considering that it was still technically illegal to be gay in most other Western countries until well into the 20th century, and in some places even until the early 2000s. At first glance, we can see this as the Enlightenment actually being good for queer people because it contributed to decriminalization. However, it's important to remember that in 1791, France was still technically a monarchy. The initial thrust of the revolution was actually quite moderate. The Tennis Court Oath of 1789 and the subsequent penning of the Declaration of the Rights of Man wasn't intended to overthrow the king and the aristocracy. All that the middle class wanted at that point was to be given more of a say in the affairs of state. The first couple of years of the revolution were led by middle-class moderates who wanted a constitutional monarchy similar to England's, where the king still had a place and the aristocratic culture could still flourish. Aristocratic culture was good for the middle class because those queer little marquises and duchesses consumed a lot of goods and services that the middle class provided. So the lawyers and merchants who actually started the revolution weren't looking to do away with rich people. To do so would have been shooting themselves point blank in the pocketbook. Nor were they particularly interested in the plight of the average peasant either. They just wanted to share power, full stop. It wasn't until the storming of the Tuileries in 1792 that France became a straight-up republic and the king was forced to abdicate, and everything and anything that even hinted at aristocratic hedonism was violently done away with. So, in 1791, when homosexuality was decriminalized in France, aristocratic culture was still alive and well, and those rich queers would have benefited from that law every bit as much as your average Joe farmer. at least until 1792. When France officially became a republic, instances of legal prosecution of homosexuality actually increased. Historian Michael David Sabalas points out in a paper on homosexuality in Napoleonic France that even though the legal treatment of gay men improved in 1791, in actual reality, records show continued police harassment and legal punishment of men who engaged in same-sex relations even after it was decriminalized. It was justified through vague laws about public indecency and corruption of youth, and eventually a post-revolution Napoleonic-era law gave state-sanctioned power to policemen to regulate and punish same-sex relationships by their own authority. I also want to point out here that decriminalizing gay sex was beneficial to men, as was most of the revolution. The revolution actually set women's rights back a lot and set women back a lot in terms of their place in society, which I will explore a little bit later on in this video. But by decriminalizing gay sex, it actually improved the lives of queer men, at least from like a legal standpoint. So that was just one of the ways that the revolution actually benefited men more so than it did women. It seems counterintuitive at first that a movement away from absolutist monarchy to a democratic state in which the rights and freedoms of the individual are legally enshrined would be bad for queer people, but when we look at it more closely from a social and cultural perspective, it makes a lot of sense. In a 2020 essay on heteronormativity during the French Revolution, historian Bailey Troth pointed out that the revolution reconfigured the French state from an absolutist model where the well-being and legitimacy of the state centered around the body, family, and court life of the king to a liberal, nationalist, and eventually republican model under which the sovereignty and strength of the state was dependent upon the activity and virtue of the nation as a whole. This promised to transform ordinary Frenchmen from subjects into citizens and asserted universal rights in place of the particular privileges of the old regime. But citizenship carries responsibilities as well as rights, and the ability of ordinary people to fulfill those responsibilities inspired new anxieties about the health of the body politic. Responsibility is the price of freedom, and when passive monarchical subjects are liberated and transformed into active democratic citizens, new nationalist frameworks are needed because they serve as an organizing principle. What takes the place of a monarch whom the people can adore? When the king is dead, what's left to collectively rally around and love and worship? When you go from subject to citizen, all of a sudden you become, at least in part, personally responsible for the continuation and well-being of the nation. And since the French Republic was so new and so fragile, revolutionary cultural and political leaders doubled down on nationalism, using Enlightenment philosophy as justification for what they deemed natural versus unnatural. As these socially conservative attitudes of the working class prevailed, being queer in any way became demonized as an aristocratic vice for one thing, and as being counter-revolutionary, unnatural, and directly opposed to the goals of the new republic for another thing. Procreation is a key feature of most nationalist rhetorics, and we see it even today with the evangelical push to eliminate access to abortion and reproductive rights. Far-right conservatives are more likely to engage in nationalist movements, and a big part of that is encouraging women to stay home and make good Christian babies who will carry on that nationalist rhetoric and tradition. Being queer therefore runs counter to the reproductive needs of the nation, and therefore it becomes a threat. This is a big reason why queer people are once again being harassed in nationalist far-right circles, and it's the reason why there was a bigger push towards enforced heteronormativity during and after the French Revolution. The worst of this heteronormativity fell on the shoulders of women, as it always does, and women's rights also began to backslide in huge ways both during and after the revolution. Misogyny and sexism. In Diderot and D'Alembert's Encyclopedia, which was published between 1751 and 1772, the entry for woman contained a description of a woman's physical appearance, followed by a line that reads, "All of these things demonstrate that the purpose of a woman is to have children and to feed them." Like Rousseau and his whole back to nature thing, Diderot was an Enlightenment philosopher, and he believed that natural meant inherently better. In this particular entry of his encyclopedia, we find the roots of gender essentialism, at least the form that it's taking in the modern world. Enlightenment philosophers like Diderot and Rousseau argued that women were made to please and be subjected by men, and that it was nature's law for women to obey men. If woman is made to please and be subjugated to man, she ought to make herself pleasing to him rather than to provoke him. Her particular strength lies in her charms. By their means, she should compel him to discover his own strength and put it to use. Enlightenment philosophy was all about rights, freedoms, equality, reason, and creativity, as long as you were a man. Women, on the other hand, were meant to be quiet, polite, innocent, pure, and motherly, because that's how nature made us. Rousseau reduces women to maternal and sexual objects, particularly in his book Discourse, where he paradoxically claims that mothers are somehow both selfishly devouring, yet embody a pure and natural state in which pity and compassion are born in women's wombs and flow outwards into the entire human species. Rousseau believed that men and women were fundamentally different and that they should be educated accordingly. In his famous book Ami, he wrote that, once it is demonstrated that man and women are not and should not be constituted the same, either in character or in temperament, it follows that they should not have the same education. In following the directions of nature, they must act together, but they should not do the same things. Their duties have a common end, but the duties themselves are different, and consequently also the tastes that direct them. According to Rousseau, men's education should prepare them to be active and engaged citizens, whereas women's education should prepare them to be good wives and mothers in order to support the men in their roles as citizens. The revolutionaries took this to heart in 1792 when France became a republic, and a lot of the rights and freedoms that women had enjoyed during the old regime disappeared almost overnight. Before the revolution, middle and upper class women played a key role in the public sphere as the gatekeepers of intellectual life. Women hosted salons and clubs at which new ideas, like Enlightenment philosophy itself, ironically, were discussed, refined, and published. The salon was a key institution of French culture and history, and honestly, it deserves its own video because a lot of the ideas and practices that we take for granted in the modern world came straight from the salons of 18th century Paris. But for the sake of time in this video, basically salons were gatherings of poets, artists, philosophers, and intellectuals that were hosted by upper class women. The women themselves decided who and what kind of people they wanted to host and what theme their salon would have. There were salons in Paris dedicated exclusively to poetry, politics, philosophy, science, etc., depending on the personal interests and passions of the women who hosted. They were a key part of public life before the revolution, and if you were an artist or an intellectual hoping to make a mark on the world, you would have had to hope and pray that some woman in Paris was passionate about and interested in your particular field of study or interest, enough to bother hosting a salon that was dedicated to it. There, you could make connections that would allow you to pursue your ideas and your art. Basically, they were like really fancy networking events that were held in the homes of wealthy and upper class women. The salons were a huge part of French culture and history, but they also existed in London and in the American colonies, which at the time wasn't the United States yet. And they were also hosted and controlled exclusively by women wherever they were held. And not in like an obligatory serve the menfolk tea and sandwiches way either. The women who hosted salons were active, lively participants in the discussions and ideas that they generated, and many of them were writers, artists, and intellectuals in their own right. The salons were a way for women who were actively interested in public life to gather the best and brightest minds under their roofs, and they blurred the lines between what we now categorize as the public and the private domains. You could argue that all the revolution really did for women was to introduce the idea of separating the public and the private spheres, an idea that's been weaponized ever since by conservative men who want to control women and keep us quiet at home. Back in the 18th century, women were not quiet at home at all. They used their homes to further their interests and their passions, and to further public life as well, and to direct and guide the discourses that were being had in public intellectual life. It wasn't just wealthy women who had an impact on public life, though. Under the guild system of the old regime, ordinary working-class women could and did apprentice themselves as milliners, dressmakers, and seamstresses. The mantua makers of the late 17th and early 18th century paved the way for women to work outside the home, earn their own living, and support themselves financially. Some of these women actually did quite well for themselves, most notably Rose Bertin, who was a policeman's daughter from a small village. She apprenticed herself as a milliner as soon as she was old enough to work, and years later became Marie Antoinette's personal stylist, and wealthier than the queen herself, sitting at the head of her own fashion empire that dressed royal women all over Europe. I did a whole video on 18th century mantua makers. Definitely go check it out if you're interested in learning more about the conditions of working women in pre-revolutionary France. During the first few years of the revolution, women actually gained a lot of rights. Similar to the decriminalization of homosexuality, early on in the revolution, a number of rights and freedoms were codified into law. Between 1789 and 1793, legislators granted women proper civil status and legal identity. Family courts were set up to settle disputes and conflicts in the home and to protect women from their husbands, who before that could abuse and lock up their wives and children and face zero consequences for it. Before the revolution, Salic law had been the norm in France, which meant that girls and women could not inherit titles or property. It mostly centered on the royal family, preventing royal women from inheriting the crown, but it trickled down to the rest of society as well. In 1791, the revolutionary government did away with Salic law and established an egalitarian system of inheritance, which allowed for boys and girls to inherit property equally and for both wives and husbands to manage household possessions together. All of this happened early on in the revolution when it was still fairly moderate. As more radical regimes began to take over after 1793, a lot of the gains that women and queer people had seen under the first thrust of the revolution began to be walked back, even though it was women who actually started the revolution in the first place. It was primarily women who made up the mob that marched from Paris to Versailles in October of 1789 to demand bread from the king. This is the event that historians most often agree is the thing that kicked off the revolution. From there, they took the royal family to Paris, and thus began the 4 years that changed the Western world forever. But by 1793, the revolutionary regime had changed hands a number of times, swinging from moderate to severely radical and even authoritarian. Robespierre was a dictator, and I will die on that hill, and then back to moderate again. By the time Napoleon seized power in the late 1790s, women's clubs and societies were seen as too radical and they were legally dissolved. After vacillating on the legal status of women for a number of years, the revolutionaries ultimately sought to do away with women's liberation because they needed to consolidate power for themselves. Enlightenment philosophy gave them an excuse to do so by arguing that it was unnatural for women to participate in public life. For many centuries, the monarchy had been construed as the natural order of things, with God being at the top of the pyramid, with the king, who derived his power and authority directly from God, sitting right underneath. The clergy and the priests of the Catholic Church were underneath the king, and below them were everybody else, all of whom were subject to the king and the church's authority. Enlightenment philosophy was so radical in its time because it upended this ingrained social order by arguing that humans themselves are part of nature, and nature is fundamentally egalitarian. A forest doesn't distinguish between king and peasant, so neither should we. As this philosophy began to take hold, the divine right of kings began to be seriously challenged for the first time ever, and that's how Enlightenment philosophers literally wrote the script for revolution. Everything they espoused through their writing was taken as gospel, and that unfortunately included the inferior position of women, whom the Enlightenment philosophers saw as being naturally weaker, yet more compassionate and morally pure than men. This naturally inferior status was thought to make women unfit for public life, in spite of the fact that we had been a key part of it for at least 200 years at that point, and so women were relegated to the private, domestic sphere as the guild system and the salons of the old regime were done away with. All in, the Age of Reason did spearhead a lot of things that were ultimately beneficial for humanity. Democracy, freedom, equality, for the most part, we still have work to do there, and the rule of law. As much as I love to poke poke holes in this stuff, we do have to acknowledge the benefits of the Enlightenment. That being said, the Age of Reason also came with a lot of baggage and a changing of the guard when it comes to power structures that I'm not entirely sure was a great thing. Our culturally ingrained idea of history as being a linear timeline forever moving towards a point of ultimate perfection is inherently flawed, and it's a patriarchal construct that conceives time as linear and progress as always good. I mentioned in the intro to this video that reason and logic are patriarchal ideas that are thought to be inherently natural to men and to the expression of masculinity. I expanded more on this idea in my video about men wearing skirts, but basically if we take a metaphorical view of this time in history, it's the story of the archetypal masculine triumphing over the archetypal feminine. Archetypally, masculine equals light, linear, solar, progressive, outward-facing, forward-moving, reasonable, rational, logical, and restrained. The archetypal feminine equals dark, cyclical, lunar, chaotic, inward-facing, backwards-moving, emotional, and wild. When looked at through this lens, the story of the Age of Reason and the intertwining of Enlightenment philosophy with politics and social organization is also the story of the patriarchy once again gaining supremacy. Not that the old regime of absolutist monarchy wasn't patriarchal, it absolutely was, don't get me wrong. But at the end of the day, legal progressivism without social progressivism has no legs, and that's the big lesson of the French Revolution. You can legislate all you want for equality and fairness, but if the culture doesn't keep up, then it will be an uphill battle all the way. If the majority of the population still believes that queer people are immoral and women are inferior, laws and books won't mean much. So even though the revolution had some good ideas and was overall a good thing, when it comes to social progress, it set us back a lot. I often wonder how much further ahead we would be now in this year of 2024 in terms of women's rights and the social recognition and acceptance of LGBTQ plus people if the revolution hadn't happened, or if it had happened in such a way as to allow the social progressivism that we were seeing amongst the elite at Versailles to continue. When social progress is seen as being elitist, there will always be a backlash against it. That's why we see such a huge upswell of far-right discourse and sentiment right now in the year 2024. Queer and trans people are being demonized once again and labeled as sexual deviants and predators just for existing. Women are being denied the right to decide what happens to our own bodies, and even egalitarian marriage laws are being challenged in some places. The divide between right and left today can be traced directly back to 1789. Back then, being queer was seen as a wealthy person's privilege, and the revolutionaries were eager to do away with anything and everything that had to do with aristocratic culture. Being a woman occupying space in the public sphere was seen as unnatural thanks to the Enlightenment philosophers, and so women were relegated to the home and told that we weren't fit to participate in public life because science says so. What it really was a divide between the educated, wealthy, upper-class elite who were socially progressive but were politically conservative and believed in the divine right of kings, and the uneducated, poor, and rural communities who believed in freedom and equality under the law but were socially and culturally conservative. Now we see the same divide happening all over again nearly 250 years later, just with a bit of a different flavor. Generally speaking, nowadays, the less educated and more rural you are, the more likely you are to be conservative and to be vulnerable to far-right conspiracy theories and rhetoric. There's a simmering hatred out there among small-town working-class populations for urban educated elites who live in big cities and have fancy university degrees and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the social construction of gender. This hatred is what's fueling a lot of the backlash, and while it upsets me deeply and scares me to my soul, I do have some compassion for where it's coming from. Over the last 40 years, small-town working-class people have seen their livelihoods being stripped away and shipped overseas by the very people who are now talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, leaving them poor and struggling and vulnerable to grifters and dictators. In much the same way as poor and working-class people in the 18th century were suffering from starvation and and massive inflation as France was pretty much being bankrupted. It's the same thing we saw in Germany in the 1930s when Hitler rose to power on a tidal wave of hatred and resentment about the impoverishment that came from post-World War I sanctions. Fascists need a scapegoat, some segment of the population upon which everyone else can unload their hatred and resentment. For Hitler, it was the Jews, for Robespierre, it was the aristocrats of the old regime, and for today's fundamentalist and conspiracy theory fascists, it's educated people who live in big cities, as well as queer and trans people. As I mentioned in a previous video about trad wives, the far-right movements of today are seeking to bring back an idealized, pastel-colored 1950s past, make America great again, hello, in which capitalism and traditional gender roles are solid and unchanging. Those ideas come straight from the founding fathers, and they got them from, you guessed it, Enlightenment philosophers. The legacy of Rousseau, Diderot, and Voltaire echoes down from the salons of Paris 2 centuries ago right into the Facebook feeds of far-right pundits. It was shouted from the mouths of rioters in Washington on January 6th. It's promoted and glamorized by tradwives on TikTok. And while it certainly did a lot more good than harm overall, it is the reason we even have a democracy, let's not forget that. We also can't forget or ignore all the ways in which the age of reason walked back social progress and ruined everything. That's going to do it, my loves. Thank you for sticking around. I'm sure a lot of you will have your own takes on this. And hey, if I'm wrong and dumb, please let me know in the comments. That's what they're there for. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and stick around because there's more where this came from. For now, I hope that you're all having a wonderful day and I will see you in the next one. Toodaloo!